we picture the history of the American West, our minds usually jump to the same images, right? Pioneers and covered wagons crossing a vast, empty wilderness. But what if that picture is completely wrong? What if the land was never empty? What if it was, in fact, a landscape of ghosts echoing with the stories of lost civilizations and forgotten empires? Today, we're going to peel back that familiar history and look at what came before. This is a hidden chapter of the American West, a story of incredible cities carved into cliffs and a desperate, almost forgotten grasp for empire on the California coast.
So here's how we're going to travel through time today. We'll start by going way back, nearly 1,000 years, to meet a society of master builders who created something astonishing and then vanished. From there, we'll leap forward centuries to the rugged coast of California, where, of all powers, the Russian Empire made a surprising and desperate claim. We're going to explore a truly unlikely alliance they formed, figure out why their ambitious dream eventually faded, and, in the end, we'll see what these very different stories reveal about the land itself. A land with a much deeper, more complex history than most of us ever learned.
So, this all brings us to the central question for our exploration today: who truly ruled the West before America? And let me tell you, the answer isn't simple. It's not one king or one country. It's a complex, overlapping story of different powers, of ancient roots, and of competing claims that really challenge everything we thought we knew about this land. To even begin our story, we have to tackle a foundational myth. This idea of an empty, untamed continent just waiting to be discovered. It's a powerful idea, but it's just not true. Long before the wagon trains, before the gold rush, even before the first Spanish missions, the West was a busy, populated, and often contested space. It was home to nations, confederacies, and empires whose stories are written not just in books, but etched into the very stone and soil of the land. Our first stop on this journey takes us to Mesa Verde, in what we now call Colorado. And here we find the absolutely stunning remnants of a civilization that mastered its environment in a way that is just, well, it's breathtaking. The story of the ancestral Puebloans is this powerful and deeply mysterious prologue to everything that came after. I mean, think about this for a second. For more than 6 centuries, that's longer than the United States has been a country, the ancestral Pueblo people were successful farmers and skilled artisans living on the flat tops of these mesas. They had complex communities, thriving trade networks, the whole shebang. But then, right around the year 1190, they made one of the most radical shifts imaginable. They started moving their entire communities from the open plateaus down into the deep, protected alcoves of the surrounding cliffs. It was just an incredible feat of engineering and social willpower. And the scale of what they built is, frankly, staggering. These weren't just a few little huts tucked into a cave. No way. These were elaborate, multi-story stone villages. The most famous one, which we call Cliff Palace, was a sprawling complex with over 150 individual rooms and dozens of ceremonial chambers called kivas. This was a sophisticated, bustling society, literally built into the side of a mountain. And then they left. Just as suddenly as they had moved into the cliffs, they moved out. After only about a century in these magnificent stone cities, the entire region was abandoned. By the year 1300, the cliff palaces fell silent. They left behind their homes, their beautiful pottery, their tools, but not a single written word to explain why. Their departure is still one of North America's greatest mysteries, a silent, powerful testament to a world that rose and fell long before any European even knew the continent existed. Okay, now we're going to take a huge leap forward in time, about 500 years. The silent stone cliffs of Mesa Verde give way to the cold, crashing waves of the Pacific coast in the early 1800s. And here, a completely unexpected power arrives on the scene, the Russian Empire. But this wasn't some confident, swaggering conquest. This was an empire stretched to its absolute limit, acting not out of strength, but out of sheer, utter desperation. So you're probably wondering, what on earth were the Russians doing in California? Well, the answer is thousands of miles to the north, in their Alaskan colonies. By the early 1800s, Russian Alaska was on the verge of total collapse. The fur trade, their whole reason for being there, had basically sputtered out. Their attempts to farm the harsh northern land had failed miserably. People were literally starving, and getting supplies across the entirety of Siberia was a logistical nightmare. They needed a lifeline, and they needed it fast. Now, the men on the front lines of this expansion were a unique bunch. They were known as the Promyshleniki. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you can think of them as fur trappers and frontiersmen. But here's the key difference. Unlike the image of the ruggedly individualistic American pioneer,
These men were essentially cogs in a massive, state-controlled corporate machine. Their every move was dictated by the Russian-American company, which was really just an extension of the Tsar's imperial will. And this timeline here really shows you the chain of events. It all started in the 1740s when explorers found a treasure trove of furs in Alaska. That kicked off a gold rush of sorts, which was quickly monopolized by the state-run Russian-American company. But decades of overhunting and mismanagement led directly to that crisis we just talked about. So their solution was a desperate leap south, jumping past British and Spanish claims to establish an agricultural colony, a breadbasket, in sunny California. And so in 1812, Fort Ross was born.
But here's the crucial thing to remember. The Russians were not entering an empty land, not by long shot. The coastal region just north of San Francisco was the ancestral home of the Kashia-Pomo and Coast Miwok peoples. And the way the Russians decided to interact with them is probably the most fascinating and unique part of this whole story. It wasn't a simple conquest. Instead, what formed was a complex, calculated, and truly unlikely alliance. To really get just how different the Russian approach was, you have to compare it to what the Spanish were doing just down the coast. The Spanish model was all about conquest, forced religious conversion, and the absolutely brutal mission system that enslaved and subjugated native populations. The Russians, on the other hand, were a tiny group, thousands of miles from home. They couldn't afford a war. They needed allies. So their approach was one of pragmatic coexistence. They established trade, they actually paid for labor, and they were looking for a strategic foothold, not total domination. And this relationship wasn't just some informal understanding. It was actually formalized in a pretty remarkable document, a treaty signed in 1817 between the Russian-American company and the local Pomo leadership. This quote from the official record really captures the spirit of that agreement. It talks about mutual assistance and gratitude. It was, for all intents and purposes, a formal acknowledgement of Pomo sovereignty over their land, which was almost unheard of in that era of colonialism. So the big question is, why did the Pomo agree to this? You have to try to see it from their perspective. They were watching the relentless, brutal advance of the Spanish missions from the south. They had heard the horror stories of the violence and disease that followed in their wake. For the Pomo, the Russians may have looked like the lesser of two evils, or even a potential counterweight, a powerful ally that could help protect them from a much greater threat. This treaty wasn't an act of submission. It was a savvy, strategic, political move by a sovereign people trying to navigate an increasingly dangerous world. And for a little while, this unlikely colony and its unique alliance actually seemed to work. Fort Ross became this incredible multicultural hub of Russians, Native Alaskans who had been brought down for their hunting skills, and of course the local California Pomo. But the grand dream of a prosperous Russian California was built on a very fragile foundation, and as it turned out, it was not meant to last. One of the core problems was economic. Yes, the long-term goal was farming, but it was the fur trade that was supposed to pay the bills in the short term. The problem? The beautiful and valuable sea otters here met the exact same fate as they did up in Alaska. They were hunted almost to extinction. As you can see, the resource that fueled the entire enterprise just disappeared, and the colony's profits vanished right along with it. But what was even more devastating was the total failure of its primary mission, agriculture. The location, which they chose because it had a defensible harbor, was actually terrible for farming. There was this persistent coastal fog that led to crop diseases. The Russian managers knew absolutely nothing about California's climate. And, maybe most crucially, as they got more and more desperate to increase their yields, their relationship with the Pomo completely soured. That system of voluntary, paid labor devolved into a system of forced labor, which understandably created friction and resistance. The farm never, ever became the breadbasket they had dreamed of. Ultimately, it all came down to a cold, hard calculation being made thousands of miles away in St. Petersburg. The financial reality was just undeniable. The California experiment was costing the company a fortune to maintain, and it was producing almost nothing of value in return. The colony that was once seen as a vital lifeline had become nothing more than a massive financial drain. And so, in 1841, the company decided to cut its losses. They sold the entire settlement, the buildings, the livestock, even the cannons, to a Swiss immigrant you might have heard of named John Sutter. This was just a few years before the gold rush would completely transform California forever. The Russian flag was quietly lowered for the very last time. And without any real fanfare, an entire empire retreated from the shores of North America. So, what do we make of these two incredible stories, separated by hundreds of years but connected by the same landscape? You have the vanished cities of the Puebloans and the failed colony of the Russians. When you put them together, they paint a picture of a West that is so much more complex, so much more interesting than the one we usually imagine. If there is one central takeaway from all this, it's this. The American West was never empty. It was never a blank canvas waiting for a new story to be painted on it. A better way to think of it is as a library of forgotten worlds, a place where the stories of countless different peoples, ambitions, and ways of life are layered one on top of the other. The stone walls of Mesa Verde and the old wooden chapel of Fort Ross, they're like pages from that library, reminding us of the other powers that ruled this land long before America. And on that note, I just want to sincerely thank you for joining us on this journey. It's really your curiosity, your desire to look past the simple, easy narratives and understand these hidden stories that brings them back into the light. It's so valued, and it reminds us all that our understanding of the past is never really finished. And this really brings us to our final thought. The ancestral Puebloans and the story of Russian California aren't just historical footnotes. They're powerful reminders. They force us to look at the world around us, at the landscapes we think we know so well, and ask a really important question. What other histories are out there, waiting just beneath the surface, ready to be rediscovered?